In the middle of Deuteronomy chapter 2, Moses refers to the generation of fighting men that was going to die in the wilderness along the way so that they would never enter into the promised land. And so God made that promise as they were 2 years into their wandering in the wilderness. That there was a generation of fighting men that you're not going to see the promised land, that you're going to die in the wilderness. They knew that was coming. But I wonder how they felt as that played out. I wonder if they ever doubted that God was going to keep that promise. So they received that promise in year 2, and I wonder if some of them believed that God was going to strike them down immediately. But then he didn't. Then a whole year went by, and they still didn't die. And then 5 years went by, and they were still there with their families. And then 10 years, and 20 years, and 30 years, and 35 years. Remember how long ago 35 years ago feels? Boy, what would that be? 1985. 1985. Do you remember promises that were made to you in 1985? And then go back 3 years before that. It's at 38 years. I wonder if any of them wondered, oh, maybe God forgot about that promise. But then after 38 years, they would have all seen that he didn't. Because not one fighting man in that generation of fighting men made it into the promised land. They all died along the way. Whether or not they doubted the promise, it still came true. Are there any promises that God gives you that are really hard to believe right now? Do you wonder if God has good plans for you? Plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you hope in a future? Do you wonder sometimes if all things work together for the good of those who love him? Do you wonder if he really will meet all of your needs like he promises? Do you wonder if he loves you? Do you wonder, or do you doubt that you're really forgiven? Whatever promise you have a hard time hanging on to, as the Bible reminds us, just because God is sometimes slow in keeping his promises doesn't mean he's not going to keep them. And someday the whole world will see. Someday Jesus will return, and every promise will be fulfilled at that point. And he'll take his believers home with him just like he promised. But if you have trouble doubting those promises along the way, then I bet that gives you something in common with Mary and Joseph. And really any believer who struggled to hold on to God's promises by the time the angel came to Mary and announced that the Savior of the world was coming inside of her womb. Because by the time that angel came, God hadn't said a word for a couple hundred years. Remember in the Old Testament, God spoke to his people a lot, sometimes directly, mostly through prophets. But then a couple hundred years before Bethlehem, before Jesus arrived in Bethlehem, God went silent. And I bet people wondered then too. But then one day they had every reason to believe that God will never forget about them. And he will never forget about the promises he made them. And what was the reminder? It was the cry of a baby. It was something so small, something so tiny, yet it spoke very loudly. It said that God remembers. He remembers all of his promises. He remembers to keep them because he remembers how needy the people are who have received them. He knows that sometimes it's hard for us to trust. He knows that sometimes our fears overwhelm our faith. He knows that sometimes this world and its temptations get the best of us. He knows that this world can hurt in some really impactful ways. So he wants you to know that he will never forget a promise. no matter how hard it is for him to keep. Even if he has to cram himself inside the womb of a young woman and live there for 9 months, and then grow up and remain on the cross when the pain really started coming. To him, it was worth it. Just so you could be here today and know that you have a God you can count on to keep his promises. Rest well tonight, my friends. Rest well, holding on to his promises.